Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left Monsieur Aronnax, Ned Land and Conseil, they had journeyed out from the Nautilus to spend some time on shore leave, something that Captain Nemo and his crew have decided is not for them. Never again, Captain Nemo said, would he walk on man's earth. But our protagonists are a little bit less scrupulous when it comes to that sort of thing. Before we begin our reading today, a quick follow-up on a comment that I made on the last video, both in the video itself and in the comments section of it on YouTube, that this book was originally published in the late 1860s, and some of its attitudes towards indigenous persons of various descriptions are rightly seen as, I think the best way to put it, as backwards and even offensive. I think that it's fair to say that they would be offensive to people today, and they should be. They are reductivist, they are colonialist, and they don't really express any understanding for the people involved. It's the unfortunate reality of reading older works of fiction, and if you care to, works of non-fiction as well, that they often espouse ideas that we find antiquated and backwards. That is one of the things about the march of progress, is that as we move forward, the things that we leave behind seem more and more distasteful. As well they should. But when we read them again, and particularly when they are presented to us, like the way that I am sharing these stories with you, it becomes a bit of a quandary. How do we present these ideas in a way that frames them in the correct context without implying that there is a legitimacy to the words that are spoken therein? And that has always been a problem for me, and I think we will find in this next chapter a number of terms and attitudes expressed by the characters that we see as distasteful. And there were a couple of ways that I could have gone about doing this. I could have sanitized in some way the language used, and I reserve the right to do so if I feel like the terminology is not only reductivist but patently offensive. But I think that presenting it in the way that it was written allows us to understand that context and see the forward progress that we have made in a light that I think is important. So if those terms are offensive to you, then I sympathize and I feel the same way, but I think that it is more important to not erase the mistakes of the past and the progress that we have made by sanitizing that language. So I hope you'll bear with me and enjoy the story in light of that, as an educational experience about the attitudes of the past and how what was acceptable then is not and should not be acceptable now. I hope you'll forgive me for that little diversion from our reading, but I just thought it was important to talk about. So thank you for bearing with me. And now let's dive right in to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea with Chapter 22, Captain Nemo's Thunderbolts. Without getting up, we looked in the direction of the forest. My hand stopped halfway up to my mouth, but Ned's completed the trip. "Stones don't fall from the sky," said Conseil, "unless, perhaps, it was a meteorite." Another carefully polished stone knocked a ringdove leg out of Conseil's hand, thereby strengthening his argument. We all three got up and shouldered our rifles, ready for an attack. "Is it monkeys?" cried Ned Land. "Almost," replied Conseil. "It's savages." "Head for the dinghy," I cried, going toward the water. It had become necessary to beat a hasty retreat, for 20 or so natives, armed with bows and slings, had appeared at the edge of a copse over to the right, scarcely 100 paces away. Our dinghy was beached about 60 feet from us. Even though the savages advanced slowly without running, they were clearly in a very hostile frame of mind. Stones and arrows rained around us. Ned Land did not want to abandon his provisions, and in spite of the fast increasing danger, he tucked the boar under one arm and the kangaroos under the other, and broke camp as fast as he could. Within 2 minutes, we were at the water's edge. It only took us a moment to put our provisions and arms in the dinghy, push it into the water, and put our oars in place. We had not gone 400 yards when 100 savages, shouting and waving their arms about, entered the water up to their waists. I looked to see if their appearance had made anybody come out on the deck of the Nautilus, but it had not. The big vessel lay out in the open water, absolutely deserted. 20 minutes later, we were climbing on board. The hatches were open. After making fast the dinghy, we went below. As I drew near, I could hear music coming from the lounge. There was Captain Nemo, bent over his organ, lost in a musical ecstasy. "Captain," I said. He did not hear me. "Captain," I repeated, tapping him on the shoulder. He gave a start and turned around. "Ah, it's you, Professor," he said. "How was your hunting expedition? Did you find any interesting botanical specimens?" "Yes, Captain," I answered, "but we've unfortunately brought back with us a herd of 2-legged creatures that makes me a little nervous." "What sort of 2-legged creatures?" "Savages." "Savages?" replied Captain Nemo in an ironic tone of voice. "Does it surprise you, Professor, to set foot on land and find savages? Where won't you find savages? Besides, these creatures you call savages, are they any worse than others?" "But, Captain—" "As for me, monsieur, wherever I went, I saw nothing but savages." "But if you don't want them on board the Nautilus," I replied, "you would do well to take some precautions." "Calm down, Professor. There's nothing to worry about." "But there are a lot of them." "How many did you count?" "At least 100. "Monsieur Aronnax," answered Captain Nemo, once again placing his fingers on the keyboard of the organ, "even if all the natives of New Guinea were gathered together on that beach, the Nautilus would have no reason to fear their attack." The captain's fingers started running over the keyboard, and I noticed that he played only on the black keys, which gave his melodies an essentially Scottish flavour. He had soon forgotten my presence and was once again deep in a reverie, and this time I made no effort to dispel it. I went back up on the platform. It was already night, for in these latitudes the sun sets quickly without any period of twilight. I could just barely make out Gueboroar Island, but numerous fires on the beach told me that the natives had no intention of leaving. I stayed alone on deck for several hours, sometimes thinking about these natives. But without being afraid, for I had been won over by the captain's imperturbable confidence. And sometimes forgetting them and admiring the splendour of the tropical night, my thoughts also drifted toward France, in the wake of stars which would be over it in several hours. The moon shone amid the constellations of the zenith. This led me to think that the day after tomorrow, this faithful, obliging satellite would return and lift the Nautilus from its coral bed. Toward midnight, seeing that everything was calm on the dark ocean as well as beneath the trees on shore, I returned to my cabin and went peacefully to sleep. The night passed without mishap. The Papuans were undoubtedly terrified by the sight of the monster grounded in the bay, for the open hatches would have given them easy access to the inside of the Nautilus. At 6 o'clock on the following morning, it was the 8th of January, I went back up to the platform. Dawn was breaking. As the mist rose, the island slowly came into view. First its beaches, then its mountain peaks. The natives were still there, but in far greater numbers than the day before, 500 or 600 perhaps. Some of them had taken advantage of the low tide and had advanced along the tops of corals to less than 400 yards from the Nautilus. I could see them clearly. They were true Papuans, with handsome faces and athletic bodies, high, broad foreheads, noses that were wide but not flat, and white teeth. Their woolly hair was dyed red, and thus provided a sharp contrast to their black, shining bodies. Bone earrings hung from their cut and distended earlobes. For the most part, these savages were naked, but I could make out several women among them dressed in grass skirts held up by belts also made from some plant. Several of the chieftains wore necklaces made of crescent-shaped objects or of red and white beads. Almost all of them were armed with bows, arrows, and shields, and around their shoulders hung a kind of net containing the stones they hurled from their slings with deadly accuracy. One of the chieftains nearest the Nautilus was examining it carefully. He must have been a very high-ranking Mado, because he was dressed in banana leaves with scalloped edges and painted in bright colours. I could have shot this native easily, for he was only a short distance away, but I thought it best to wait for really hostile demonstrations. In relations between Europeans and savages, it is best for the Europeans not to attack first. During the entire period of low tide, these natives prowled around the Nautilus, but without being in the least troublesome. I heard them repeat the word "Asai" many times, and by their gestures I understood they were inviting me to come ashore with them, an invitation I felt I should decline. So for the entire day, the dinghy did not leave the side of the Nautilus, to Ned Land's great annoyance, for he had wanted to complete his supply of provisions. This clever Canadian spent his time preparing the food he had brought back from Gueboroar Island the day before. As for the savages, they headed back toward the beach at about 11 in the morning, as soon as the tops of the corals began to disappear beneath the rising tide. But I could see that more and more of them were congregating on the beach. They were probably coming from neighboring islands or from New Guinea itself. Nevertheless, I could not see a single native dugout canoe. With nothing better to do, I thought I would try dredging these lovely clear waters in which I could see masses of shells, zoophytes, and marine plants. Moreover, it was the last day the Nautilus would be spending in these waters, that is, if it managed to get free during the next day's high tide, as Captain Nemo had predicted. So I called Conseil, and he brought me a small, light dredge, more or less like those employed by oyster fishermen. "About those savages," he said, "if monsieur doesn't mind me saying so, they don't seem to have very bad intentions." "All the same, they're cannibals, my boy." "A cannibal can still be an honorable man," replied Conseil, "just as a glutton can be honest. One doesn't exclude the other." "That's all very well, Conseil. I'll even grant you that these cannibals are honorable, and that they go about devouring their prisoners honorably. But since I don't like the idea of being devoured, even honorably, I'll stay on my guard, for the commander of the Nautilus seems to be taking no precautions whatsoever. Now, to work." We fished for 2 hours without bringing up anything of value. Our dredge would fill up with Midas's ears, harp shells, melanii, and the loveliest hammer shells I had ever seen. We also brought up several sea cucumbers, pearl oysters, and a dozen small turtles, which were reserved for the kitchen on board. But then, when I was least expecting it, I put my hand on something marvelous, or rather, I should say, a natural deformity that is very rare. Conseil had just brought up the dredge filled with various ordinary shells, when he suddenly saw me plunge my hand into the net, pull out a shell, and utter the conchologist's cry, the most piercing noise the human throat can produce. "What happened to monsieur?" asked Conseil, very startled. "Has monsieur been bitten?" "No, my boy, even though I would have gladly given a finger for this discovery." "What discovery?" "This shell," I said, holding up the object of my triumph. "But it's nothing more than a porphyry olive shell of the genus Olivae, order of Pectinibranchia, class of gastropods, phylum of mollusks." "Yes, Conseil. But instead of having its spiral going from right to left, this olive shell has it going from left to right." "Is that possible?" cried Conseil. "Yes, my boy. It's a left-handed shell." "A left-handed shell?" repeated Conseil excitedly. "Look at its spire." "Oh, believe me, monsieur," said Conseil, as he took the precious shell in his trembling hands, "I've never felt such a thrill." And it was, indeed, something to be thrilled about. As naturalists have pointed out, right-handedness is one of the laws of nature. Stars and their planets move and rotate from right to left. Man usually employs his right hand rather than his left hand, and consequently the things around him, such as staircases, locks, watch springs, etc., are made to be used from right to left. Now, nature generally follows this law for the spirals on its shells. They are all right-handed, with rare exceptions, and when one happens to find a specimen that is left-handed, collectors will pay you its weight in gold. Conseil and I were absorbed in the contemplation of our treasure, and I was promising myself to give it to the museum when, as luck would have it, a stone, thrown by a native, came and shattered this precious object in Conseil's hand. I let out a cry of despair. Conseil grabbed my gun and aimed it at a savage waving his sling about 30 feet away. I tried to stop him, but he fired and broke the charm bracelet hanging on the native's arm. "Conseil!" I cried. "Conseil!" "What's wrong? Can Monsieur see that this cannibal attacked first?" "Yes, but a shell isn't worth a man's life," I said. "Oh, it's a scoundrel!" cried Conseil. "I would have been happier if he had broken my shoulder." Conseil was in earnest, but I could not agree with him. The situation, however, had changed in the last few moments without our having noticed it. There were 20 or so canoes around the Nautilus. They were the kind made from hollowed-out tree trunks, long, thin, and very fast. They were kept upright by means of 2 bamboo pontoons floating on the water. The men paddling them were half naked, and their advance made me somewhat uneasy. It was obvious that these Papuans had already come into contact with Europeans and were familiar with their ships. But what were they making of this long iron cylinder stretched out in the bay without masts or funnel? It undoubtedly made them nervous, for at first they had kept at a respectful distance. Nevertheless, seeing that it didn't move, they had gained confidence little by little, and were now trying to get more familiar with it. But it was precisely this familiarity that had to be prevented. Our guns, which made almost no sound when fired, would produce little effect on these natives, who only respected things which made a great deal of noise. Lightning, without thunderclaps, would scarcely have frightened them at all, even though the danger lay in the lightning itself, not in the noise. The dugout canoes were drawing near the Nautilus, and suddenly a cloud of arrows landed on the ship. "Good Lord, it's hailing!" cried Conseil, "and maybe the hail's been poisoned." "We must warn Captain Nemo," I said, as I went below. I entered the lounge. No one was there. I gathered up my courage and knocked on the door of the captain's cabin. A voice said, "Come in." I entered and found Captain Nemo deep in mathematical calculations, covering sheets of paper with X's and other algebraic signs. Am I disturbing you?" I said, trying to be polite. "Yes, you are, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain, "but I can only imagine that you had very serious reasons for doing so." "Very serious. We're surrounded by native dugout canoes, and within several minutes we'll undoubtedly be attacked by a couple of 100 savages." "Oh," said Captain Nemo calmly. "Have they come with their canoes?" "Yes, monsieur." "Well then, Professor, all we have to do is close the hatches." "Precisely, and I came to say that—" "Nothing could be simpler," said Captain Nemo. He pressed a button and transmitted an order to the ship's crew. "Everything's been taken care of, monsieur," he said, after several moments. "The dinghy is in place, and the hatches closed. You couldn't possibly be worried that these gentlemen might stave in a hull on which cannonballs from your frigate had no effect." "No, Captain, but there's still another danger." "And what's that, monsieur?" "It's that tomorrow, at about this time, the hatches will have to be opened again to replenish the Nautilus's air supply." Unquestionably, monsieur, since the vessel breathes like a whale. But if the Papuans are on the platform, then I can't see how you'll be able to prevent them from entering. Then, monsieur, your guess is that they'll come on board. I'm sure they will. Well then, monsieur, let them come. I can't see any reason for preventing them. After all, they're nothing but a bunch of poor devils, and I don't want a single one of these wretched Papuans to lose his life because of my visit to Gueboroar Island. I was about to leave when Captain Nemo suggested I sit down next to him. He seemed very interested in knowing about our excursions on shore and about our hunting expeditions, but he did not seem to understand the Canadian's violent need for meat. Then the conversation touched on several other topics, and Captain Nemo, without being any more talkative than usual, seemed friendlier. Among other things, we talked about the Nautilus's present situation, and its having run aground on exactly the same spot where Dumont d'Urville had almost lost his ships. Then the captain said, D'Urville was one of your great sailors, one of your most gifted navigators. He was the Captain Cook of France. The poor man. To have confronted the ice floes of the South Pole, the coral reefs of Oceania, and the cannibals of the Pacific, only to die miserably in a train wreck. If such a man had time to reflect during the last seconds of his life, imagine what his thoughts must have been. As he talked about d'Urville, Captain Nemo seemed deeply moved, and I can only put this to his credit. Then, looking at a map, we went over what the French navigator had done. His trips around the world, his double attempt to reach the South Pole, which had resulted in the discovery of Adélie Island and Louis Philippe Land, and finally his charting of the principal islands of Oceania. What your d'Urville did on the surface of the ocean, said Captain Nemo, I have done beneath the surface, and more easily and completely. Whereas the Astrolabe and the Zélé were at the mercy of storms, the Nautilus is like a calm, stationary studio in the midst of the ocean. Yes, Captain, I said, but there's still one way in which the Nautilus resembles Dumont d'Urville's corvettes. How, monsieur? It's that the Nautilus has become stranded, just as they did. The Nautilus is not stranded, monsieur, Captain Nemo answered coldly. The Nautilus is built to rest on the ocean floor, and all the things d'Urville had to do to refloat his ships are unnecessary for me. The Astrolabe and the Zélé almost perished, but the Nautilus is in no danger at all. Tomorrow, at the exact time I told you, the tide will calmly lift up the ship, and it will once again be on its way through the ocean. Captain, I said, I don't doubt tomorrow at 2:40 p.m., added Captain Nemo, getting up. The Nautilus will be afloat and leave Torres Strait without having suffered the slightest damage. This was said in a dry tone of voice, and afterward he made a slight bow. He was asking me to leave, and I went to my cabin. There I found Conseil, eager to know the results of my interview with the captain. When I suggested that the Nautilus was in danger from the Papuans, he answered me very sarcastically, so all I can say is to have confidence in him and go to sleep without worrying. Monsieur does not need me for anything? No, my friend. What's Ned Land doing? With Monsieur's permission, answered Conseil, Ned is making a kangaroo pie, which is going to be superb. I remained alone and went to bed, but I didn't sleep too well. I could hear the savages walking about on the platform and occasionally letting out blood-curdling yells. But the night passed by without the crew doing a thing. They seemed no more disturbed by the presence of these cannibals than soldiers inside a fort would worry about ants crawling over their fortifications. At 6 in the morning, I got up. The hatches had not been opened. The air inside had therefore not been renewed, but the reservoirs, always filled against any eventuality, were functioning and letting a little oxygen into the impoverished atmosphere of the Nautilus. I worked in my room till noon, without seeing Captain Nemo even for a moment. No one on board seemed to be making the slightest preparations for departure. I waited a while longer, then went to the lounge. It was 2:30. In 10 minutes the tide would reach its maximum height, and if Captain Nemo had not made a rash prediction, the Nautilus would be set free at once. If not, it would be many months before it would leave its coral bed. Nevertheless, I could feel the submarine making slight movements, forerunners of when the ship would be set free. I could hear the hull grating against the hard coral. At 2:35, Captain Nemo appeared in the lounge. "We're about to leave," he said. "Oh," I replied. "I've given orders to open the hatches." What about the Papuans?" "What about them?" answered the captain with a slight shrug of his shoulders. "Won't they get inside the Nautilus?" "How?" "By going down the hatches you've opened." "Monsieur Aronnax," Captain Nemo calmly replied, "you can't go down the Nautilus's hatches that easily, even when they're open." I looked at the captain. "You don't understand," he said. "No, not at all." "Well then, come and see." I went toward the companionway. There I found Ned Land and Conseil watching several members of the crew opening the hatches, while from the outside could be heard curses and cries of rage. The hatches opened outward. 20 horrible faces appeared in the opening. But the first of these natives who put his hand on the railing of the companionway was thrown back by some invisible force and ran off, shouting and jumping about wildly. 10 of his companions followed him and suffered the same fate. Conseil was ecstatic. Ned Land, carried away by his violent instincts, rushed for the companionway, but as soon as he grabbed the railing with his hands, he too was thrown back. "Good Lord," he cried, "I've been struck by lightning." This explained everything. It was no longer a mere railing, but an electrically charged cable stretching up to the platform. Anybody touching it would get a powerful shock, a shock that would have been fatal if Captain Nemo had charged this railing with all the electricity at his disposal. One could really say that between him and his assailants he had placed an electric barrier that no one could cross unharmed. In the meanwhile, the Papuans had retreated in terror. As for us, we laughingly consoled and massaged poor Ned Land, who was cursing like a man possessed by the devil. But just then, at precisely the moment predicted by the captain, the Nautilus was raised up by the sea and left its coral bed. The blades of its propeller struck the water slowly and majestically. Little by little it increased its speed, and sailing along the surface of the ocean, it left the dangerous waters of Torres Strait. safe and sound. Chapter 23. Bitter Dreams. On the next day, January 10th, the Nautilus once again began cruising underwater, but at a remarkable speed, which I estimated at no less than 35 knots. Its propeller was turning so fast that I could neither follow nor count the revolutions. When I thought what electricity had been made to do aboard the Nautilus, not only giving it motion, heat, and light, but also protecting it against attacks from the outside, my admiration became boundless, not only for the ship, but also for the engineer who had designed it. We were headed due west, and on January the 11th we passed Cape Wessel, which is situated at 135 degrees east longitude and 10 degrees north latitude, and forms the eastern tip of the Gulf of Carpentaria. There were still many reefs, but they were no longer so close to one another, and here too they were very accurately marked on the chart. The Nautilus had no difficulty avoiding the Money Shoals on her port side, and the Victoria Reefs on her starboard, situated at 130 degrees west longitude, along the 10th parallel, which it was following. On January the 13th, Captain Nemo sighted Gueboroar Island at 122 degrees west longitude. This is a body of land covering 12,500 square miles and governed by Rajahs. These monarchs consider themselves the descendants of crocodiles, which they claim is the highest possible origin a human being can have. As a result, the rivers of this island are full of their scaly ancestors, which the inhabitants worship. They are protected, spoilt, adulated, nourished, and fed young girls, and woe to the outsider who touches one of these sacred animals. But the Nautilus had no desire to come into contact with these horrible creatures. Timor was only visible for a moment, at noon, while the first mate was taking our position. In the same way, I only got a glimpse of Roti Island, which is part of the same archipelago, and whose women have a great reputation for beauty in the markets of Malaya. From then on, the Nautilus altered its course toward the southwest. We were heading for the Indian Ocean. Where were Captain Nemo's whims taking us? Would he go back toward the coast of Asia? Would he head for European waters? This seemed unlikely for a man fleeing the inhabited parts of the globe. Would he therefore turn southward? Would he go around the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, and then push on to the Antarctic? Would he finally return to the Pacific, where his Nautilus could navigate freely and easily? The future would tell us. On January the 14th, after going alongside the Cartier, Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott reefs, the land's last efforts against the water, we lost all sight of land. The Nautilus had considerably reduced its speed, and we would sail alternately underwater or on the surface in the most capricious way imaginable. During this part of the trip, Captain Nemo made interesting experiments on ocean temperatures at different depths. Such experiments usually are done with rather complicated instruments, and the results are doubtful at best. Whether they are obtained by thermometrical sounding gear, which often breaks beneath the water pressure, or by devices which can make use of the varying resistance of metals to electrical currents. But Captain Nemo could merely go down and take the temperature at whatever depth he wanted, and his thermometer, in contact with the surrounding water, would give him an instantaneous and reliable reading. It was thus that the Nautilus, either by filling its reservoirs or diving by means of its side fins, reached the successive depths of 10,000, 13,000, 17,000, 23,000, 30,000, and 33,000 feet, The final result of these experiments was that the ocean has a constant temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 3,000 feet in any latitude. I followed these experiments with great interest. Captain Nemo seemed completely absorbed in them. I often asked myself what his aim was in making these observations. Was it for his fellow men? I doubted it, for one day or another his work would perish with him in some unknown sea, unless, of course, he intended to give me the results of his experiments. But this would have meant that admitting that my strange voyage was to end at some point, and this end was not yet in sight. In any case, Captain Nemo also told me of other figures he had obtained, which established the relationship between varying densities of water in the world's principal oceans. From this information, I was able to draw a personal lesson which had nothing to do with science. It was on the morning of January the 15th. The captain, with whom I was strolling on the platform, asked me if I knew the different densities of seawater. I said I didn't, and added that science was lacking accurate observations on this subject. "I have made such observations," he said, "and I can answer for their accuracy." "Yes," I said, "but the Nautilus is a world all of its own, and the secrets of its scientists don't reach men on shore." "You're right, Professor," he said, after several moments' silence. "It's a world all of its own. It is as foreign to life on land as those planets which accompany the Earth around the Sun, and we will never know what results might have been obtained by scientists on Saturn or Jupiter. But since fate has brought us together, I can tell you the results of my experiments." "I'm listening, Captain." "As you know, seawater is denser than fresh water, but this density is not uniform. In fact, if we represent the density of fresh water by 1, I have found that the density of the water in the Atlantic to be 1.028, and that in the Pacific 1.026, in the Mediterranean 1.030. "Ah," I thought, "he ventures into the Mediterranean." 1.018 for the Ionian Sea, and 1.029 for the Adriatic. There was no doubt about it. The Nautilus did not avoid the more frequented seas near Europe, and I concluded that he would take us, perhaps fairly soon, toward more civilized lands. This news would make Ned Land very happy. For several days, our time was spent doing all sorts of experiments on the varying salinity of water at different depths, on its electrical content, its coloration and transparency, and in all this work, Captain Nemo showed an ingenuity which was only equalled by his kindness toward me. Then, for several days, I saw him no more, and once again I lived aboard in isolation. On January the 16th, the Nautilus seemed to be resting only several feet below the surface. Its electrical machinery was not functioning, and its stationary propeller allowed the ship to rock back and forth at the mercy of ocean currents. I guessed that the crew was busy repairing something inside the submarine, which had given way under the strain of the machinery's violent mechanical movements. My companions and I then witnessed a strange spectacle. The panels of the lounge were open, and since the Nautilus's light was not on, the water around us appeared like nothing more than an area of vague darkness. Overhead, the sky was stormy and covered with thick clouds, therefore only dimly lighting the upper layers of the ocean. I was observing the state of the sea under these conditions, in which the largest fish could only be seen as a dim shadow with scarcely any outline, when suddenly the Nautilus became surrounded with light. At first I thought the light on the top of the submarine had been turned on, and that its powerful rays were illuminating the waters, but I was wrong, and soon I was able to see how mistaken I had been. The Nautilus was floating in the midst of a phosphorescent layer, which, in the semi-darkness, seemed extraordinarily bright. This effect was produced by myriads of tiny, luminous animals, whose glitter increased as they touched the submarine's metal hull. I also saw flashes of light in the midst of these waters, looking like streams of melted lead in a blazing furnace, or metal brought to a red-white heat. They were such that, by contrast, some of the other luminous areas were like shadows in the fiery waters, from which all shadows should have disappeared. No, this was no longer the calm gleam of normal light. It was full of an extraordinary intensity and movement. This light felt as if it were alive. In reality, it was produced by an infinite number of tiny marine organisms, minute noctilucae, drops of transparent jelly with a thread-like tentacle, up to 25,000 of which have been counted within the space of 30 cubic centimeters. And their light was increased yet more by the peculiar gleam of jellyfish, starfish, aurelia, pidux, and other phosphorescent zoophytes impregnated with that sea foam made from organic matter decomposed by the ocean, and perhaps with the mucus secreted by fish. For several hours the Nautilus floated amid these brilliant waters, and our admiration increased at seeing large marine animals playing about in them, as if they were fire-eating salamanders. There, surrounded by this fire which does not burn, I saw elegant, fast porpoises, those tireless clowns of the sea, and 10-foot-long sailfishes, those heralds of hurricanes, whose formidable swords occasionally struck the window of the lounge. And we also saw smaller creatures, various kinds of triggerfish, jumping scomboideae, wolffish, and 100 others who left dark streaks in the luminous water. We were enchanted by this dazzling spectacle. Was some atmospheric condition increasing the intensity of this phenomenon? Was some storm raging on the surface? If so, the Nautilus felt none of its fury 10 or 20 feet below. It merely rested peacefully in the midst of calm waters. Thus our trip continued, continually producing new marvels to excite our wonder. Conseil would observe and classify his zoophytes, articulata, mollusks, and fish. The days went by quickly. I no longer even counted them. Ned, as usual, tried to find ways to vary the diet on board. We were like snails. We had become adapted to our shells, and I could state from experience that it is very easy to become a perfect snail. So our existence seemed easy and natural, and we no longer thought about another kind of life on land. Then something took place which reminded us of the strange situation we were in. On January the 18th, the Nautilus was at 105 degrees east longitude and 15 degrees south latitude. The weather was menacing, the sea rough and wavy. A strong east wind was blowing. The barometer had been dropping for several days, and it now told us that a struggle of the elements was soon to come. I had gone up on the platform just as the first mate was taking our position. As usual, I waited to hear the daily phrase repeated, but that day it was replaced by another, no less incomprehensible. Captain Nemo appeared almost at once, and with a telescope began observing something on the horizon. For several minutes The captain remained immobile. Then he lowered his telescope and exchanged a dozen or so words with the first mate. The latter seemed in the throes of some emotion he was vainly trying to contain, but Captain Nemo, having more self-control, remained cool. Moreover, he seemed to be making objections, while the first mate was trying to assure him of something, or at least that is what I gathered from the conversation by their various tones and gestures. As for me, I looked carefully in the same direction, and saw nothing. The sky and sea met along the horizon in an absolutely clear, unbroken line. Nevertheless, Captain Nemo paced up and down the platform without looking at me, perhaps without even seeing me. His step was firm, but less regular than usual. He would occasionally stop, cross his arms, and look out at sea. What could he be looking for in that vast space? The Nautilus was several hundred miles from the nearest coast. Then the first mate would take up his telescope again, look obstinately at the horizon, and also pace up and down, stamping his foot, obviously much more nervous than his commander. But I felt this mystery would soon be cleared up, for on Captain Nemo's orders the ship increased its speed. Just then, the first mate again drew the captain's attention to something. The latter stopped his pacing and pointed his telescope at the place indicated. He looked through it for a long time. All this intrigued me immensely, and so I went down to the lounge to get a very powerful telescope I often used. Then, leaning on the searchlight housing which rose up on the forward part of the platform, I got ready to scan the entire horizon. But I had not yet gotten it up to my eye when the telescope was abruptly snatched out of my hands. I turned around. Captain Nemo was standing before me, but I scarcely recognized him. He wore such a frown that I could scarcely see his sullen, flashing eyes. His set jaw, rigid body, clenched fists, and bowed head showed that his entire frame was in the grip of some violent anger. He did not move. My telescope had fallen from his hand and rolled toward his feet. Had I, without meaning to, provoked his anger? Did this strange person imagine that I had uncovered some secret forbidden to passengers of the Nautilus? No, I was not the object of his hatred, for he wasn't even looking at me. His gaze remained fixed on that invisible point on the horizon. Then Captain Nemo once again regained his usual composure and calm. He spoke several words to the first mate in their strange language, and then, turning toward me, "Monsieur Aronnax," he said in a commanding tone of voice, "I'm going to ask you to carry out part of our bargain." "What do you want me to do, Captain?" "You must allow yourself to be locked up along with your companions until I decide you can be set free again." "I have no choice," I answered, looking at him fixedly. "But could I ask you just one question?" "No, monsieur." After such an answer, arguing was out of the question. I could only obey. Resistance would have been impossible. I went down to the cabin occupied by Ned Land and Conseil and told them about the captain's decision. I leave the reader to imagine how the Canadian received this piece of news. But there was no time for explanations. 4 members of the crew were waiting at the door, and they took us to the cell in which we had spent our first night on board the Nautilus. Ned Land tried to protest, but the only answer he got was to have the door closed in his face. "Could monsieur tell us what this is all about?" asked Conseil. I told my companions what had happened. They were as astonished as I, and knew just as little. I became lost in thought. I could not forget the strange, worried look on Captain Nemo's face, but I was unable to make two logical ideas follow one another, and I was getting involved in the most absurd thoughts when I was pulled from my reverie by Ned Land. "Look, here's our lunch." And indeed, the table was all set. It was obvious that Captain Nemo had ordered this to be done at the same time he had told the crew to increase the Nautilus's speed. "With Monsieur's permission," said Conseil, "I would like to make a recommendation." "Yes, my boy," I replied. "Well, it would be best if Monsieur ate, for we don't know what might happen." "You're right, Conseil." "But this is the same food we get every day," complained Ned Land. "Yes, but what would you have said, Ned?" asked Conseil, "if they hadn't given us any lunch at all?" There was nothing the harpooner could say to that. We sat down and started in. The meal passed in comparative silence. I ate little. Conseil, with his usual prudence, forced himself to eat something. Ned Land was the only one who hadn't lost his appetite. After we had finished, each of us went to rest in a corner of the room. Just then, the light went out, leaving us in complete darkness. Ned Land was soon asleep, and surprisingly enough, it was not long before Conseil was also in a deep slumber. I was wondering what had brought on this extraordinary need to sleep when I felt my brain becoming more and more drowsy. In spite of all my efforts to keep them open, my eyes slowly closed. A painful suspicion crossed my mind. Some sleeping powder had obviously been mixed with the food we had just eaten. Imprisonment was, therefore, not enough to keep us from knowing about Captain Nemo's doings. We had to be put to sleep, too. I could hear the hatches closing. The gentle rocking motion of the ship stopped. Had the Nautilus left the surface? Had it gone down to deeper, calmer waters? I tried to fight off my drowsiness, but it was impossible. My breathing grew feebler, and I felt as if a mortal cold were creeping up my almost paralyzed limbs. My eyelids closed like dead weights. I fell into a morbid sleep, full of hallucinations. Then the visions disappeared and left me completely unconscious. And that, my friends, is where we will leave our reading today. I hope you have enjoyed this interlude, and I hope that the light that it sheds onto 19th century ideas was illuminating, if not enjoyable. Thank you so much for joining me today on Soft Stories. I must leave you now, but until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.